Tim Weis from University of Alberta in Canada. Interestingly, of course, Alberta has fossil resources, but it's good to see we have people there who are strongly working for renewable energy. And Tim, it's a pleasure to welcome you. You have a quite long also background in renewable energy as an advisor working for associations, but also as a scientist, researcher. And now you will give us an idea of the developments and the policies that worked and worked not so well in Canada. Tim, are you with us?
Yep. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Welcome, Tim.
Good. Thanks.
Floor
Thanks
is
for
yours.
having me. Let me just see if I can share my screen here. Oops. Okay, I hope you can.
Yes, looks
you
good.
Can see this? Perfect. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. I realize I'm at the end here, so I'll try to go quickly through what is a little bit of a complex story in Canada. So I won't introduce myself any further than has already been introduced, but in case you're interested in some of the work that I've done, this is a summary. I've worked in renewables for about 20 years, and what I'm working on in Alberta right now at the university is looking at the impact of renewables onto the market and how we might see benefits of geographic dispersion of wind throughout the province, as well as some of the trying to estimate when what the duck curve, or as increasing amounts of solar might enter the market, and how that changes long-term market prices. So that's some of the work that I'm doing right now. But let me try to give you a real quick overview of the Canadian context. The Canadian system is, as you'll see here on the right-hand side, about 60% of our power comes from hydro already, and with another 15% or so from nuclear, and then 5 or 6% from other types of renewables, wind being the largest one. And depending on where you stand on nuclear, there's different opinions on it, but looking at the Canadian perspective by and large is that we got only about 17% or so of the electricity coming from sort of non-CO2 emitting fuels. So that would be natural gas and coal. And so the remaining amount, 82% of the system, would be sort of typically what's perceived to be as carbon CO2 neutral. And so the target right now in Canada is 90% CO2 or low emitting carbon by 2030. That's kind of the federal target. And so we've got a pretty big advantage of having starting with a huge amount of hydro in the system overall. One of the complexities in looking at the Canadian system is that it's a huge country, and we have by and large, most of the different provinces have their own electricity systems, and you can kind of see the varying prices across the country depending on where you are. Just to give a context or perspective of how big Canada is, this is you can see in the bottom here, overlaying some European countries compared to the different provinces in Canada, and we only have about 37 million people in the country, half of which kind of live in this region here. So about 22 million or 20 odd million people kind of live in that region, and the rest of the country is spread out over this huge geographic area. So it's hard when we talk about Canada it's hard not to look at it as more as individual provinces than looking at the country as a whole. Also because our systems are actually regulated by the individual provinces and controlled by the individual provinces, most of which are owned by the provincial governments in the electricity systems, except for Alberta's and Ontario's, which is the two that I'll be speaking about mostly today. And the other complexity in Canada, as you can see, depending on where you are in the country, the electricity mix can look very different. We have some jurisdictions like Quebec, which is almost 100% hydro, whereas other jurisdictions, where I'm going to speak about where I'm from in Alberta, has been predominantly a coal-based system. In fact, we have only about a little over 10% of the population in Alberta, but 50% of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from the Alberta system, and the overwhelming amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the country really come from a handful of jurisdictions, largely the ones that have significant coal bases in their system. So even though it's a relatively small amount nationally, depending on subnationally where you are, it can be a fair bit. So if you look at, so the bottom left graph here shows Canada's greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade. These numbers come from the federal government themselves, and the one area that I think Canada has seen some success in is in electricity, where we're starting to see electricity emissions come down, and that has in large part actually been from Ontario, which you can see in the top right-hand corner here, where you can see that they've had a pretty major success in reducing emissions from their electricity system, and we'll talk about this in a minute. But they were successful in phasing out coal in their system. The other province we'll talk about is Alberta, and we're kind of going in the opposite direction, and that's in large part due to the oil and gas sector expansion. So I'm going to speak about two provinces in particular, Ontario and Alberta. And so these are the two provinces which have relatively large. Ontario has the largest wind fleet in the country, and Alberta has the second largest. So we'll speak about those two in particular today. A quick history of what happened in Ontario. In 2003, there was a government change, and there was a promise to phase out coal by 2007. Ultimately, that was implemented by 2014, so a little bit late, but it was successful in actually phasing out the entire coal fleet. You can kind of see from moving from 2015 to 2005 to 2015 that the entire coal fleet was phased out of the system. So that was an important thing to remember, because that's what started a lot of the transition in the electricity sector in the province. Then there was renewable energy programs that were added, started with auctions targeting about 1,500 megawatts of renewables. And then we started moving towards Feedin Tariff program. It was a small program to start with for under 10 megawatts projects, with prices coming in kind of in this range. So 11 cents per kilowatt hour. And 42 for wind and hydro and biomass, and 42 cents for solar. That program then had a major change in 2009, and the Green Energy Act was brought in. And this was what we would consider sort of a more traditional feed-in tariff program, which kept basically lifted the cap from the 10 megawatts and allowed a much larger development of projects. It was very successful in driving rapid uptake and significant growth in renewables in the province. One of the things that the Green Energy Act brought in was residential solar, which came in at about 80 cents per kilowatt hour. And this actually became a pretty significant flashpoint, because this is about 10 times the price of domestic electricity. And this, for the opponents of the system, often quoted this number as saying how expensive this overall program was. And so even though it wasn't necessarily representative of the broader program, that number became a flashpoint that people spoke about a fair bit. But you can see on the bottom left here the success of the program and how quickly it drove renewables into the market. At the same time that coal was being phased out of the system, and the success in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the overall Ontario electricity market. The program, unfortunately, was a bit of a victim of its own success. There was lots of projects that were built, including many with community and Aboriginal partnerships, and you can see the number of contracts that were signed immediately after the program was brought in. There was a 2-year frenzy almost of project development, and it became a bit of a victim of its own success, in that it happened faster than I think the government perhaps anticipated. And then you can see, unfortunately, what happened afterwards was that there was a huge drop off, and the program changed, and they switched back to more of an auctioning program afterwards, in part because they were seeing faster uptake than I think they were prepared for. The other major issue that happened at the time was electricity prices went up significantly. So they almost doubled over that time frame. And unfortunately, because prices were going up at a time when the feed-in tariff system was implemented, a lot of people conflated those two issues. And the feed-in tariff got blamed for the electricity price doubling in about over that time frame. When in fact, so it was responsible for some of those increases, and I don't want to decompose the overall electricity price in Ontario, but just looking here on the right-hand side, you can see the components of wind, solar, and biomass in terms of it's just, this would be the component wind, solar, and biomass in the overall, which is would be part of this yellow bar here. So it's there, but it's not the overall. It's not the only. It's not the only contributing factor. Nuclear actually plays a larger. It's a much larger part of the system, but it also plays a larger role in the overall what we call global adjustment. However, the problem was that most people. You get into fairly complex story trying to tell that story, and the fact of the matter is most people saw electricity prices going up and development happening very, very quickly, and this 80-cent solar people, the opponents talk about, and we saw a pretty significant backlash in Ontario. There were significant protests in the rural parts of the province, and in fact, Ontario became one of the most vocal jurisdictions in all of the world opposing renewable energy, often talking about health issues and the concerns about health impacts in the rural parts of the province. So what happened then was we recently had a change in government, and they actually not only so the feed-in tariff program was gone even under the original government that implemented it, but the current government actually started tearing up some of the contracts and going as far, not only canceling contracts for projects that hadn't been built, but even actually, in some extreme cases, some projects that were actually already under construction started to dismantle them. So that became, so that's unfortunately the situation that has resulted in Ontario. There was some manufacturing capacity that developed in the province as a result of the feed-in tariff program, but a lot of that, once the demand, the growth dried up, then most of that manufacturing capacity is gone. So unfortunately, where Canada stands is that Ontario is widely perceived as the jurisdiction of what not to do. We can talk about some of the things that Ontario did wrong, especially in terms of not reviewing their feed-in tariff numbers as quickly as they should have. But unfortunately, in Canada, the perception is that feed-in tariffs are expensive and really cause the market to be driven up. And so it's more complex than that, but that's definitely the political perception across the country as a result of what happened in Ontario. So let me flip now to Alberta, a slightly different story on the other end of the country where I live. If you've heard of Alberta, you probably think of it from the huge oil sands deposits in the north of the province, and this is what you see here on the right-hand side. But you might not know that we also have a heavy coal-based electricity system, and the emissions from coal is actually in the past has been relatively close to the emissions from the oil sands sector. So we have multiple greenhouse gas issues to deal with. In 2015, so we had a government that was in place for 44 years. And that government, for the first time, changed in 4 decades to a social democratic government in 2015, and they were interested in trying to change that image of the province and try to start reducing greenhouse gases in the province. And so they were actually able, you can see at the bottom here, to implement what we call the Climate Leadership Plan, where they've actually got CEOs of oil sands companies on stage with environmental groups and basically saying we want to go forward and we want to reduce emissions in the province and trying to find a way of improving the overall image of the province. It was a very complex program, and with all sorts of different components to it. But what I just want to quickly talk about are these three major issues because they pertain to the electricity system: a coal phase out, a renewable energy target, and carbon pricing. So first off, we had a coal phase out. Alberta, not too long ago, actually was about 70% of the entire system coming from coal. Well, we're down below 50% right now, and the target was to phase it entirely out by 2030, which would mean sort of truncating the life of 6 of the major coal units in the province by 2030, and growing renewables to about 30% of the overall market. So that was the one target that was in place, and then they put in a auction program in order to get renewables built, and it was a contract for difference program. So it was an auction where if you had the market price and you bid what you needed for wind, then you would collect whatever you could out of the market, and then the difference, if the market price was below that, the government would pay you from carbon tax revenues that difference, and if you were above that, you actually pay that premium back to the government. And this was widely perceived as being an economical way to do this. The major shock that came in when this was announced was that the prices, so we contracted about 1,350 megawatts worth of renewables, and the prices came in below $40 per megawatt hour, which, if you remember from the Ontario system, is about 1/3 of what was being paid in Ontario. And so this was actually widely seen as a huge success, that people had this perception of renewables as being very, very expensive from the Ontario story. And then when the Alberta auctions came in, were actually significantly lower. And so this sort of changed the narrative a little bit about how low-cost renewables are. And then at the same time, the government also procured solar for its own consumption. This is a much smaller contract, but it procured solar in at around I think it's $48 Canadian per megawatt hour for its own consumption. And so there was a solar farm built specifically for the government. And so when those two things happened, suddenly you saw renewables as being a much lower price than they'd been perceived in the past. The last thing I quickly want to touch on is that we also implemented a carbon system. We had a carbon pricing system in the past, but this one was a significant increase in terms of the prices that were charged to in the electricity sector in particular, where basically you were benchmarked against the emissions of a natural gas plant. So if you had a high performing natural gas plant, under here, if these are your greenhouse gas emissions, you were given those emissions for free. And then anything above that, you would pay $30 per ton above that number. And so it meant that if I had a good performing gas plant, I would have a relatively low emissions price to pay. But if I had a coal plant, it could translate into as much as sort of $20 per megawatt hour carbon penalty. So that became a pretty significant penalty that coal plants had to pay. The other major thing is that wind or renewables were also given a credit. So if we had zero emissions from a renewable system, they were given this credit, which then they could then turn around and market. And so you also had renewables able to benefit from this carbon pricing system. So all those things were put into place. It was largely seen as successful, but the government changed back from the Social Democratic government to a more conservative government, which has been the traditional government in Alberta. And one of the first things they did was cancel the renewable energy projects, or they've kept the existing contracts, but not procuring any new ones. But they left in place the carbon pricing as well as the coal phase out, in part because there's a federal requirement for both of those two things. And so now on the bottom right-hand side, this is the CEO of the major, one of the utilities that has the largest coal fleet in the province, and they're actually saying that they want to get out of coal as quickly as they can. And so there's been a change in narrative in the overall province. You can see, so this is when that new carbon pricing system was implemented around 2018, the significant drop that we've seen in coal in the province over that time frame. We have seen an increase in natural gas as a result, but we have seen coal dropping. And just 2 weeks ago, we had 1 hour for the first time ever in the province. We had a very, very windy day and low demand as a result of COVID, where wind actually surpassed coal for the first time. It was only 1 hour, but it was the first time that ever happened, which is pretty remarkable if you think that Alberta was 70 or 80% coal just a decade ago, to imagine that could actually happen. So all that said, things have changed. But the perception of renewables is very different now in the province than it was. Even though the procurement of renewables isn't going on anymore, there's actually a lot of growth that's expected. If you look at the people that are expecting to build renewables or if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, anyone who is interested in developing any sort of new electricity system in the province, that you sign up in a queue, and you actually see that renewables, people are looking to build them on their own, and that is in part due to the fact that you can get that carbon credit, as well as the fact that we're seeing that people realize just how cheap renewables are, and we're actually starting to see companies starting to contract bilateral contracts for their own power by buying renewables. So to quickly sum up then, unfortunately, you can see the difference between Ontario and Alberta. The system in Ontario, and I want to emphasize, this is not necessarily a result of Feedin Tariffs, but it was a result of the way that Ontario implemented their Feedin Tariff. They probably could have done a lot better, lowering the prices and reviewing it much quicker. It's also a fact of the matter is that Ontario started their program when renewables were in a different phase of their technological development compared to where they are in Alberta, or when Alberta was implementing its program, where prices were much, much lower. The perception as a result is that renewables, that the auctions have delivered a more successful results, and that the prices have been lower. And so we're actually seeing projects continue to get built in Alberta, whereas Ontario is kind of going in the opposite direction. So some of the key lessons then, I think things that we've all talked about is stability is important and predictability. Some of the problem, one of Canada's challenges is that these programs have not always survived government changes. And so that makes the market sort of go in fits and starts so being able to find a policy that is acceptable through government changes is going to be pretty important. The Canadian perspective has been that the consumer cost or the consumer benefit has been a pretty significant part of the public debate. And so that has become part of the political narrative. And so the importance of being able to keep prices down is going to be important in terms of the overall political viability of policies in Canada. So I'm a little bit over, but that sums up, hopefully gives you a very quick snapshot into a fairly complex situation and different parts of the country. So, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. I think this has been extremely useful, because also reflecting how politics and policies are depending on each other. I think it's really very helpful to see. I mean, we've been involved in getting this Green Energy Act in the year 2009 adopted with our World Energy Conference that we had in Ontario at that time, and it's been a bit sad to see how that then later was not implemented in the way that we had hoped to. Anyway, what I would first see is whether there are any questions from our audience. I don't see anything directly here, so if you have any questions, please type them here in the chat. Otherwise, thank you very much, Tim. That was, again, excellent and gives us a very good idea of the situation, in particular in an interesting state like or province like Alberta. What I take from your presentation, but also from the other presentations, which reported about countries, be it Austria, India, of course Germany as well. Now we heard from Canada, is that the Feedin Tariff worked very well. It was a very effective way, and I believe also efficient way, but it seems that the public debate started on the costs. What are the costs that society has to pay for that? And I think, Tim, you mentioned in particular the cost for solar PV, which of course appeared quite big. I can tell you from my home country, Germany, that was same. But I think it's important to understand that, or we're all aware that the cost of PV, thanks to such high feed-in tariff, is now much, much lower. And when we talk today about renewable energy, we are not talking about such a cost burden anymore, but about an advantage. So obviously, We heard about the systems that worked, that really made the markets work. And the big challenge is still how to overcome the gap between the real cost today and the perception of that in the public debate, and come to support systems which can be implemented, which can make benefit of the cost decretion on the one hand, and at the same time can also be effective, make sure that we have a diversity of investors, as we heard from India in particular, as it was the case also in Germany. So that I believe is the big strategic challenge. We heard a very interesting proposal from Hans-Josef Fell, how we could, which steps we could do in the future. And I think it's been very interesting to hear in particular the cost estimation that he's come up with, because for a full renewable energy supply, 8 cents per kilowatt hour is of course, euro cent per kilowatt hour is of course something that should not make too many people nervous. But I think in some countries also that would in particular bring the price rather down. Tim, I see here you have a comment. Yeah, that related to Ontario. Would you like to make a final statement on that here also?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to, I don't want to leave the impression that it was necessarily the policy of Feedin Tariffs, but it was more how it was implemented in Ontario that I think was one of the big issues, and that it wasn't reviewed as quickly as it probably should have been for various reasons. And then the other complexities that were going on in the system with the coal phase out and contracting natural gas, there was a bunch of other things that were going on that all compounded that. So I just want to I don't want to leave you all with the impression that even though we saw high prices in Ontario, it's a lot more, it's a much more complex issue than just the Feedin Tariff program. So.
I remember also well at that time that of course this was implemented under the headline of community power and supporting communities and community power, in particular in the case of wind power, that did not really work out. I was in touch years after that was implemented with, for example, some First Nation projects in the North Ontario. They were still struggling. They were not able really to make use of that Feedin Tariff, while at the same time the government, I think, made a big strategic mistake by giving special privileges to, it was Samsung at that time, a large company, which somehow destroyed a bit the original narrative that we do something for the people. That certainly was also one element that, at least according to my perception from still quite far away, was not so useful, the change in how that project was presented.
It's definitely a complex story. The unfortunate reality, though, is that it has resulted in sort of the stigma against Feedin Tariffs in Canada, and that's just kind of the reality that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. So the good news at this part of, I think at this point of time, is that renewables are much cheaper. The big challenge is now we have the two crises, the climate crisis, corona crisis, and it seems that renewables are the perfect match to answer both crises. There's no doubt that it's the answer to the climate crisis. And we discussed 2 weeks ago community power in times of crisis, where many speakers said that now, as governments are now focusing more on national vulnerability, that actually creates an additional advantage for decentralized renewable energy. I think this is a new kind of debate, a dimension of the debate that we also have to be aware of, that we need to also use when we argue in favor of renewable energy. So with this, I believe we come to the end of our webinar. Great thank you first again to you, Tim, also for getting up early. A very nice remaining day. Again, thank you very much to all our speakers, to our partners, and to the audience. I saw also there was a lively debate going on here in the chat. As I said before, we will make the recordings of this webinar available on the website. We also happy, of course, to receive your feedback. And again, then thank you to Energy Watch Group, to our supporter, Profec, German Profec Ventus. And with this also to announce that the next webinar will take place in 2 weeks from now and will deal with another topic, which will be small wind. So you're invited to that as well. You will, of course, receive an invitation as far as you do not tell us that you do not want that. Again, if you want to support us, there are 2 options. You can join us as a member. You can also, as a company, become a partner of this webinar series. And of course, one form of support is also joining our discussion and furthering the agenda and international debate. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good remaining or starting day, and see you again in hopefully the near future. All stay healthy and safe. Goodbye for now.